The answer begins in the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil flows through that narrow waterway. The moment this conflict escalated, Hormuz stopped being a map location and became a pricing mechanism. Oil jumped. Traders started gaming out worst-case scenarios. If shipping is disrupted for long enough, the consequences do not stay in the Gulf. They move through freight, fuel, insurance, and inflation expectations. And in the United States, the first number people feel is not Brent crude. It is the price on the gas station sign. That is where this stops being Middle East news and becomes American household news. Higher gasoline prices hit commuters first. Higher diesel prices hit trucking, and trucking hits food. A military strike in Iran can show up days later in the cost of getting to work, stocking a grocery shelf, or moving inventory across the country. And once that happens, this is no longer only a foreign policy event. It becomes part of the inflation story, part of the Fed story, part of the 2026 midterm story. Investors are already thinking in exactly those terms. Because the danger here is not just higher oil, it is the return of inflation risk at the exact moment markets want rate relief. If energy stays elevated, rate cut hopes get pushed back. Growth expectations weaken, risk assets wobble. The dollar benefits from safe haven demand. Defense names gain attention. Energy producers get repriced. Airlines, transport, and rate-sensitive consumer sectors take the hit. In other words, even before the political objective becomes clear, the economic winners and losers start to emerge. And that is why the phrase, war economy, matters here. Not because war is good for the economy in any broad human sense. It is not. But because war reallocates money, attention, and state power very quickly. Defense contractors may benefit from replenishment cycles, missile interceptors, air defense systems, and larger budget commitments. Energy producers can benefit from a more persistent geopolitical premium in crude. Safe haven flows can reinforce demand for dollars and treasuries. Meanwhile, the losers are easier to identify. Iranian civilians, regional stability, diplomacy itself, and consumers in oil-sensitive economies, including American households. That is the brutal asymmetry of events like this. The destruction is local, the pricing power is global, and there is one more layer that makes this story feel even larger. For the United States, the idea of shaping Iran by targeting not just its capabilities but the structure of its power has deep historical echoes. The shadow of 1953 is impossible to ignore. That was the year the CIA backed the removal of Mohammad Mosaddegh and helped restore a pro-Western order under the Shah. This is not the same moment. The conditions are different, the actors are different, and history never repeats in a neat way. But the older pattern still matters. Iran has long been a place where energy, regime legitimacy, strategic access, and Western intervention collapse into a single geopolitical argument. That is why this strike matters beyond the strike itself. The narrow version of the story is simple. Iran posed a nuclear danger, diplomacy stalled, and force was used. But the wider version is more uncomfortable. It suggests that the nuclear file may have been only one layer of a much bigger calculation, one that included regime weakness inside Iran, political pressure on Trump, political pressure on Netanyahu, the logic of military-industrial demand, and the knowledge that any shock in Hormuz instantly reshapes prices far beyond the battlefield. So was this really a war to stop a bomb, or was it a moment when nuclear fear, regime pressure, domestic politics, and energy economics all converged into one decision? We cannot answer that with absolute certainty yet, but we can say this much. On February 26th, the language was diplomacy. By February 28th, the language was force. And once that shift happened, the issue stopped being only about Iran's nuclear program. It became a question about regime survival, a question about oil, a question about inflation, a question about elections, a question about who profits when a crisis gets bigger and who pays when it does. And for American viewers, that may be the most important point of all. Because whatever this war was meant to achieve in Tehran, the first durable answer may appear somewhere much closer to home, on a gas pump, in a grocery bill, in a market sell-off, or in a campaign message asking voters to choose between fear and stability. That is what makes this more than a strike. It may be the moment a nuclear crisis turned into a new pricing system for politics, energy, and power. Nuclear non-proliferation was the stated reason, but the first thing markets priced in was not uranium enrichment, it was the cost of gasoline in America. On February 26th, negotiators met in Geneva for a third round of U.S.-Iran talks, with Oman saying there had been substantial progress and technical follow-up discussions expected in Vienna. There was no final deal, but there was still a diplomatic track. Then, just 48 hours later, the United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran. And those strikes did not simply hit facilities. They were followed by the death of Ali Khamenei and the opening of a succession crisis inside the Islamic Republic. So the real question is not just what was hit. The real question is why this happened then. If this had only been about the nuclear file, the timing is hard to ignore. Diplomacy had not succeeded, but it had not fully collapsed either. The door was still open, at least a little. And yet military action came before that door could close on its own. That is why this looks less like diplomacy failing and more like war overtaking diplomacy before diplomacy could move any further. Now, that does not mean the nuclear rationale was fictional. The IAEA had real concerns. Its reporting raised questions about Iranian cooperation, access restrictions, and activity around underground facilities near Isfahan. There was a genuine verification problem, so the phrase nuclear threat was not invented out of thin air. But that still does not explain the scale of the political message, because once the strikes were followed by Khamenei's death, the entire story changed. This was no longer just about centrifuges, enrichment levels, or missile sites. It became a story about regime stability, a story about whether the target was only Iran's capabilities or Iran's political structure itself, and that is where the deeper interpretation begins. Iran was already under severe internal strain. Its currency had collapsed, inflation had torn through household budgets, protests had spread as economic pain became political anger. When a system looks brittle from the inside, outside powers start seeing a window, not necessarily a clean path to regime change, but a moment when pressure might finally break something that years of sanctions could not. That matters because in Washington, this possibility was not appearing from nowhere. There had already been reporting that the Trump administration was weighing ways to exploit Iranian unrest, including options aimed at security institutions and leadership nodes. In that sense, the strikes did not feel like a sudden emotional reaction. They felt more like the military expression of a political idea that had already been circulating. If Iran is weak enough, maybe force can do what pressure alone could not. And once you see that, the domestic political clocks start to matter. In the United States, Trump had just taken a major hit when the Supreme Court ruled against his use of IEEPA to impose sweeping tariffs. That was a direct blow to one of the central pillars of his economic posture. It does not prove that the Iran strikes were launched to bury that defeat. That claim goes too far. But it is still true that the national conversation moved quickly from tariffs and legal limits on executive power to war, security, and presidential strength. And that is exactly why the old wag the dog frame reappears whenever foreign escalation and domestic political pressure arrive at the same moment. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu had his own reasons to value an external security crisis. He was under electoral pressure. Polling had been difficult. His coalition remained vulnerable. And in that environment, few things are more politically useful than a confrontation that recenters the entire national debate around security, survival, and leadership. That does not mean Trump and Netanyahu shared identical goals, but it does mean both men were operating under political urgency. And that matters, because wars are often explained in military language while being timed by political calendars. Then comes the part American viewers cannot afford to treat as distant. Who pays for this?